Welcome to another exciting podcast of Royal Oak Victory Church. We're glad you've joined us. We are a community devoted to God, connected to others, and influencing our world.
My parents say there's no such thing as a bad day, that it's all how you look at it. What can I tell you, parents? Here is what I know. They're wrong. My name is Alexander, and I'm the expert in bad days. This guy knows what I'm talking about. That's not coming off. Did I mention my dad is a relentless optimist?
Well, we're in the home stretch.
And look at Mom. She's not fooling anyone with that mom smile. Believe it or not, by the time we got home, this van was in better shape than we were. There's my sister Emily, the actress. Always ready to take a bow. Anthony, my brother, a total winner with a great sense of style. And baby Trevor. Sorry, pal. Definitely not coming off. Bottom line, today was an epic disaster. The worst day possible. Everyone in my family would agree. But what they don't know is it was all my fault. And it wasn't over yet.
Jump in this morning and tell you a little bit more about Alexander, who you saw there in that clip. And as you can pretty well tell, he's having one of the worst days of his life. And his family, at least at the start of the day, is so overly optimistic that they don't even see the day as being that bad. He gets so little sympathy that he begins to wonder if bad things only ever happen to him. But as you saw, that theory is quickly proven to be incorrect. His whole family, his dad and his mom, right through to his siblings, Anthony, Emily, and baby Trevor, they go from one disaster to the next until we are left with a vision of a crumpled minivan, a wonderful powder blue suit, a green face, a sick sister, tired parents, and a big surprise behind the front door. And I'm not going to spoil the surprise and tell you what it was. You're going to have to go watch the movie yourself. But the title of the movie, I think, says it all. Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Who's here seen the movie or they've read the book? Yeah, quite a number of you. It's a great movie. It's a good book. I'd encourage you to take a look. It's a lot of fun, especially for families. And I think that description describes it pretty well. And I think a lot of us could say at some point in our life that probably described our situation. That in the midst of whatever circumstance it was, or maybe you're even in that circumstance right now, that you could describe it as being a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, week, month, year, whatever it is. And like Alexander said, I think we have all come to that point where once in a while we've said, you know what, it's all my fault. And it wasn't over yet. We all have seasons like that in our lives, times when our circumstances are so bad that in the midst of them, we cannot see how we're going to get through it. And even in hindsight, when we look back, we're wondering how we ever made it through. Whether it's because of a job loss or a financial crisis, whether it's words that have hurt us, relationships that are fractured, failures that plague us, the negative circumstances that we encounter in life are just a fact of life. And often we end up crying to God, asking why does it hurt or why it won't end. We have even gone to the extent of blaming God for the exact situation that we are in, questioning our faith and our trust in Him. And yet in the midst of the circumstance, at its darkest point, we have to remember that God is there, comforting our hurt and perfecting us through it. It's one of the reasons why we've been spending the month of October going through a series that we have called Developing Negatives. Because just as film negatives are developed in dark to create beautiful pictures, so too does God work in us, in our darkest points, to perfect us. We've spent the last 2 weeks looking at a couple of topics. The first one was words. And how the words that are spoken to us, not just from the outside, but the ones that we speak to ourselves, how we can get through that negativity. And then last week we spent time looking at negative relationships, especially those really difficult ones, and how in the midst of that, God can work in and through us. And today I want to continue on with that, looking specifically at circumstances and why we hurt. Circumstances and why we hurt. So if you have your Bible with you today, turn with me to the book of Job, chapter 1, Job chapter 1. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible, you can turn about a third of the way through it. If you find Psalms and Proverbs, you just go back one book, you'll find Job there. And what I love about the book of Job, that even though it's in the middle of the Old Testament, scholars tell us that it is in fact the oldest book in the Bible. It was probably the first one written based on what they're able to determine. And so for me, that gives it a lot of interest and weight that I spend a little bit more time reading this book than I normally do, the other books of the Bible. And so I want to encourage you to jump there. Now, at the beginning of chapter 1, we meet the man named Job, who the book is named after. And we find that this man, the Bible actually describes him as the greatest man to live at that point in time. He's incredibly wealthy. He has servants and he has camels and goats and all sorts of stuff in the thousands. But he's not just blessed financially, he's also blessed in terms of relationships. He's got a great family, kids, and wonderful friends that like to rally around him, although we'll see in a bit what that looks like. But we just find that this guy has basically got it all together. And he loves God too. He's seen as blameless and upright, that he spends time worshiping God. And so he kind of has it all together. Right? If we were to kind of take the wealth and the prestige of, say, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Bill Gates and all these guys and kind of cram them all together and have one guy, this is kind of who we're talking about. And so we pick this up here in Job chapter 1, verse 6. It says, "One day the members of the heavenly court came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser Satan came with them. 'Where have you come from?' the Lord asked Satan. And Satan answered the Lord, 'I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on.' Then the Lord asked Satan, 'Have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil.' Satan replied to the Lord, 'Yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face.' 'All right, you may test him,' the Lord said to Satan. 'But whatever you do, or do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically.' So Satan left the Lord's presence." Verse 13, describing the worst day you can possibly imagine. It says, "One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting at the oldest brother's house, a messenger arrived at Job's home with this news. 'Your oxen were plowing with the donkeys feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided us. They stole all the animals and killed all the farmhands. I am the only one who escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. 'The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds. I am the only one who escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, a third messenger arrived with this news. 3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants. I am the only one who escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking," do you see repetitive nature to this? "Another messenger arrived with this news. 'Your sons and daughters were feasting in their oldest brother's home. Suddenly a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed and all your children are dead. I am the only one who escaped to tell you.'" I think he could probably describe this as a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. But we see here right in the end, he says, Job stood up, tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. If that weren't bad enough, we then move on to Job chapter 2, and it says that Satan goes back into God's presence, and he says, "Look, he's still not cursing you. I think I can do more." And God says, "You know what? Go for it. Just don't kill him." And so he covers Job from head to foot in these terrible sores and boils, and what we find is Job sitting in ash, scraping his skin with a broken piece of pottery, and his wife comes up to him and says, just curse God and die. Now, I don't think any of us could say that we've had a day like this. But in the midst of some of our most difficult circumstances, it can sure feel like that. Now, we all know that circumstances or negative circumstances are not unavoidable. Now, yes, there are consequences. We can make stupid decisions and end up with difficult consequences, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the situations where we can't avoid the negativity and the negative consequences that comes our way. What we need is not something to avoid these situations, because that's impossible. In fact, the only way I could think of avoiding negative consequences is to somehow lock yourself away or put yourself in an isolation bubble, and I don't think that's practical. So what we need is an approach to actually dealing with these negative situations, these negative circumstances, because they will arise in our life. And what we're looking for is a godly approach to getting through these circumstances so that we come out the other side better than when we went in. This approach and its key points, this godly approach that we're talking about, is actually right here in Job chapter 1. It's how he responds to this situation. And what we see first is that we need to understand that it's not always my fault. It's not always my fault. Because how often have we been in difficult circumstances or difficult situations and we fixate upon what we may have done to cause the problem? We pick apart the situation. We look at it from every angle, trying to decide which decision or which karmic action we put into place that has resulted in our current negative situation. Because we get it in our minds that somehow if we can work out how we got into this mess, maybe we can figure out a way out of it. But not every bad situation, not every hurtful situation is a result of something we did or didn't do. Sometimes things just happen to us outside of our control. Take a look at Job. He's having the worst day of his life, maybe the worst day ever recorded in all of human history for one person. Right? And not a single aspect of it was his fault. Right? In fact, he was so focused on pleasing God in every aspect of his life that the writer of Job says that he would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. He's talking about his children. For Job said to himself, perhaps my children have sinned and have cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular practice. I mean, this was a good guy. This was a blameless guy. This is a guy that God knew. And in fact, God said he was a man of integrity. He had wealth. He had relationship. He had a righteous life. And yet bad things happened to him. I feel very strongly today that there are some of us that can't get past the fact that somehow the current predicament that you are in is your fault. And if you were to remove yourself from the situation, if you were to take the emotion away, or maybe you were to ask someone who is trusted to look at your situation, they would very clearly see that what you're going through right now is just a result of circumstance. It's not your fault. And so it's time to let it go. It's time to begin moving through it to its eventual end. Because the problem is, if we don't do this, when we hang on to the guilt or the condemnation or the unforgiveness, we create this dangerous spiral where we trap ourselves in our negative situation by not allowing ourselves to get out of it. We repeat it over and over again in our minds, wondering why we can't move forward, revisiting the situation, overthinking it time and time again. And what we do is we become the culprit and creator of our own bitterness. And it's in those moments, when we take the negative and make it our fault, that we begin to question the sovereignty of God. Maybe the answers that we're not getting or that we can't seem to be able to hear. And the writer of Hebrews warns us of this. He says, watch out that no poisonous bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. You see, when we allow ourselves to confront our negative circumstance, we then allow ourselves to open up, to allow God into the midst of it. Because not every circumstance is the result of Satan going before God and saying, I want to test this person. In fact, I would say most of the stuff that we go through is not a result of Satan going right after you specifically. But we do need to understand that every negative situation is an opportunity for God to develop us further and to reveal his glory. I've seen it time and time again in my life and in walking through situations with people in my life, that when we have approached a difficult situation in the right way, when we have used a godly approach, when we have set ourselves aside and said, okay, it's not my fault, I just need God in the midst of this, that it then becomes a testimony for Jesus to ourselves and to those around us. But this revelation was not something that I learned the easy way. A couple of years ago, it was actually before I met my wife, I went on a missions trip to the Philippines. And while I was there, one morning I woke up and I noticed that I had a couple of small bites on my feet, one on each foot. I didn't think anything of it. I thought, okay, it's probably just mosquitoes, and I had taken my malaria medicine and done all the precautions that I was supposed to do, and so I just ignored it. But over the next couple of days, my feet swelled up so big that I couldn't wear shoes and I could barely wear sandals. It was at the point where I found it difficult to even walk, and even putting my feet into buckets of ice water did no good. And it just got worse and worse, and yet I had to keep doing what I was doing and serving with my team and doing the preaching and working with these teams. I just had to keep going, and so I just kept doing it. Right? And there was more than one time where when no one was looking, I would cry out to God and go, God, why are you not fixing this? Why is this not just resolving itself? Why aren't you healing what I'm going through? But during the day, I would put on the proper face, and so my team kind of took their cue from me, and they just thought nothing was wrong. They just thought it wasn't that big of a deal. But that's because that's what I was presenting, when inside I was going through turmoil. I was trying to figure out how I could fix it. And one of the guys on my team, it was actually one of the Filipinos, just as we were leaving to return to Canada, said something to me that has stuck with me to this very day. He said, the way you have handled the situation with your feet has really inspired me to live my life focused on God regardless of my circumstances. Because despite how negatively that trip was and how much I despised that trip when I was on it, I look back fondly on that trip, because I saw how God worked in and through me when I allowed him to do so. The thing is, I didn't blame myself. I cried out to God. I was honest with God in my prayers, but not once did I blame myself. Now, in my situation, it was a little bit easier because I'm not the one that bit my own foot, right? In fact, I found out when I got home from my doctor that what had happened to me is that I had been bitten by a spider. And so got on the right meds and was fine, although trying to wear sandals in February, because that's when we got back from our trip, is not so much fun. Had to do that for about a week here in Canada. So yeah, we'll move past that. But anyways, I didn't blame myself. I just allowed God into the midst of that circumstance. But it was a hard lesson to learn. 3 weeks of struggling with my faith, going, God, what's going on? Until I heard that statement. Peter writes something very similar in his first letter. He says, so be truly glad. There's wonderful joy ahead, even though you may endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show you that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Every circumstance is an opportunity to learn and to grow, but also to give God the glory. But we have to allow him into that situation. And that leads us to the second thing that we see here in this first chapter of Job, how we can approach our negative situations with a godly intent. And that is that we have to understand that it's a process. We have to understand that it's a process. Now, the house I grew up in Cochrane was very unique. When we moved in, the basement had been turned into a Western-style bar, complete with hay bales. Now, what intrigued me about this basement wasn't the fact that we had a fire hazard in our basement or that the guy had built a bar in his basement, but was the fact that he had set aside a portion of the basement to be a dark room for photography. Now, we had never used it for that. My mom used it for a pantry and a cold storage room. But I can remember countless times as a kid playing hide-and-go-seek in the dark. Now, I don't know why we did it in the dark. It was more fun that way, I guess. We'd play it in the dark, and I would always go for that room because I knew how pitch black it was, that even if the door was closed, even if there was a light on in the other room, no light got into this room. It was pitch black. And I remember even in high school, our high school had a dark room, and there was a little red light that would be above the door, and if that red light was on, it was like first day orientation. You did not go into that room. And the fact is, I had to remind myself, because I never really got the chance to develop photography or develop negatives myself. I always just did what Pastor Davis talked about. I went to the local camera store and just let them handle it. But I was always intrigued by the process. Didn't have the patience for it, but I was intrigued by it. Now, my wife's a photographer, and so I spent some time talking with her, and I also wanted to look this up online because it's a bit of a lost art, right, to figure out how the process works for developing photography. And as I was studying this over the last couple of weeks, it really struck me that in the development of negatives, from film into negatives and then into pictures, how much patience and precision was necessary to get a good print. That any rushing along the way, any attempt to skip a step, or in any way that you didn't take care to make sure that no light entered into that room, would result in a damaged or a destroyed negative. And this isn't the era of digital technology where you took like 50 billion pictures on your phone. You lost your roll, you lost everything. To develop the negative, the photographer has to trust the process, no matter what, so that they can see the end result. And the idea is no different for us when we are dealing with the negative situations, the negative circumstances in our life. We have to trust the process. We have to allow for the time for God to be able to work in us and in the situation. We have to be patient that He is working on our behalf in the midst of the situation. And we have to take care that we don't desire to race through it to the conclusion before the potential that exists is able to be developed. And the interesting thing I find in this is the fact that patience is considered a gift of the Spirit, which means that without God, you can't have patience. And yet that is what is required. We have to go through the process. The whole book of Job outlines this. If we were to take the time and go through it chapter by chapter, we would see that the arguments that he has with himself and then with God and with his friends and with his wife all lead through this process. But what amazes me about Job is that right from the outset, right in chapter 1, we see that he understood that it was going to be a process, that there was going to be a patience aspect that was needed. He never wavered in his faith in God, right from the very beginning, even as he tried to work it out for himself. Right from the start, he said, "Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. You see, Job understood that things just happen in our life that are outside of our control. But when these negative things come along, we have to let them run their course. James wrote to the early church in the same way and about the same thing. He said, right at the start of his letter, he writes, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing." When we're faced with difficult, hard, or negative events, We need to make sure that our attitude isn't one of complacency or denial or fear, but instead we have to approach it with an expectancy that God is going to work in it. It's an attitude check. And sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do when we're faced with what we're faced with. It requires us to do what Job did. And the third thing that we see here in this godly approach is that we have to understand that God is with me. We have to understand that God is with me. It is absolutely imperative that we comprehend the necessity for Jesus when we're faced with hurtful or negative circumstances. We just cannot face these situations and hope for continued success throughout our life without a relationship with Jesus Christ. That has to be first and foremost for us to be able to develop the negative. And I'm just going to speak plainly. In all of the negative situations I have been in or that I have walked through with people, I cannot comprehend going through those things without God. There is a peace that comes, there is a patience that comes, there is a comfort that comes, even in the darkest points, when Jesus is there. If anything, when something like this strikes us down, it should cause us to draw closer to God instead of farther away from Him. But this isn't always our response. Even if we're able to move past the self-blame and work our way through the process, we forget that He is there and that He wants to help us. Instead, we resort to questioning God and His existence, asking questions like, how could He let this happen to me? Or how come He doesn't answer me? Or how come He abandoned me? The current financial and economic situation or climate that we are in is a perfect example, and Brian mentioned this already, and I know there are some of us here who have been directly impacted by the situation, and we've got job insecurity, and we've got job loss, or we've had to take pay cuts. But there are a number of us who haven't been directly affected by it, and yet it still consumes us. And instead of trusting in God and helping Him guide us through the process, we have allowed ourselves to be consumed by the fear and the negativity that surrounds us. Instead of relying upon God, we have relied upon our savings or our job security. And we have made decisions based on that fear and based on that insecurity instead of having God come into the middle of it and give us the peace that we need. Our focus has been lost, and we've lost sight of even what Paul said in Romans chapter 8. He says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. For we know that for those who love God, all things, let's say that together, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to His purpose. It starts and ends with Jesus. It does in our finances, it does in our attitude, it does in our circumstance, it does in every aspect of our life. It starts and ends with Jesus. But the fact of the matter is, not all of us have that relationship. Not all of us are close enough to God to say, you know what, I can call on Him in those times of trouble. And if you've never accepted Jesus into your life, that has to be first. Everything else that we've talked about, being able to approach these negative situations in a godly manner or in a godly approach, cannot happen without God. You have to have Him with you. And if you're in the midst of a negative situation right now and you're trying to do it on your own, it's going to be a lot harder. And you need Jesus. And if today you want to take that opportunity to say, you know what, yes, I do need Jesus. I need Him in this situation. I need Him in this circumstance. Then I would encourage you that at the end of the service today, come on forward. We would love to talk with you, pray with you. We've got some information for you to help you on the start of that journey. To invite Jesus into your situation. And if you don't feel comfortable coming forward, I completely understand. That information is also available at our guest center. But don't miss out on that opportunity. He's right here. He's right in the middle of it. And many of us know that fact. Sometimes we need to remember it, but we all know it. So today we need to ask ourselves, where's our focus? Where's my focus? In the middle of negativity, in the middle of stress, in the middle of worry, in the middle of panic, in the middle of fear or hurt or whatever it is, where is your focus? What are you looking to? Is it on your problems? Is it on your fears? Are you blaming yourself for your current situation? Are you being limited by allowing your own self-assessment to keep you trapped? Do you trust the process? Or are you trying to rush your way through it just to get through this negativity as fast as I possibly can? Or are you relying on Jesus? It's a hard question, even for those of us that have walked with God for a long time. Our focus slips. Where is your focus? Because it's time that we focus on the right thing. We need to declare that the difficult circumstance will not define us, but instead we will allow God to use it to develop us. Paul continues just a few verses later in Romans chapter 8. He says this, "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died, more than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death nor life nor angels nor rulers nor things present nor things to come nor powers nor height nor depth nor anything else in all creation, no terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, my addition, will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord." The choir is going to share a song with us this morning that conveys the cry of our hearts when we focus on God. And as they sing, if you have any negative areas in your life right now, I want you to take the opportunity to get your focus back where it should be. Back on Jesus Christ. To allow him to comfort you in that place of hurt, to direct you where wisdom and guidance are needed, or to develop you in an area that he has pinpointed for his crafting perfection. I'd encourage you to open that door. Let's take this moment as an opportunity to trust the process and to move past that which is holding us back.